throughout Greenleaf's published work, he wrote about a number of characteristics of servant leadership. And in 1992, I pulled those together as a kind of a top 10 list of servant leader characteristics based upon a reading of his work and actually going through and ticking them off. And those 10 that I've identified that he spoke most frequently about in various writings were listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to the growth of people, and building community. Would you share your thoughts with us on one or two of these characteristics?
Of the 10 characteristics of servant leadership, which I think are beautifully laid out by Larry Spears, I've really enjoyed the way that they too, in a manner of speaking, they deconstruct typical patriarchal, overly westernized society. Not that fatherhood isn't excellent or that Western thought and logic and reason isn't excellent, just that they can be taken out of, they can be used wrong in a lot of ways. And the 10 characteristics, I think, help us realign into what does it mean to be together? What does it mean to actually be servants to one another? Not servant meaning slave, servant meaning what you do when you love someone. I want my children to do really well in the world. I want the people I'm around to experience life at its most ultimate. I want the organization I'm in or the nation I'm a part of to be in great relationship with other organizations and with other nations. That kind of servanthood. Not the kind where a person is dominated or enslaved or subsumed by the power of another person or by the inappropriate influence of another person or another entity, organization, or nation. So when I think about the 10 characteristics, they hold many really elegant pathways to helping us live more fully as human beings with each other and live in ways that we can answer to the great questions and the great problems of humanity. So when I pick a few characteristics to focus on, some of the ones that are dear to my heart are foresight, healing, and building community. So when I think about foresight, I think of foresight probably differently as a clinical psychologist than I would if I was trained in another field. As a clinical psychologist, foresight is something that not only can be trained but should be trained. And that when we lack foresight, we should want to be held responsible for lacking foresight. That's a difficult concept, especially in a current setting in America where it's not easy for us to be responsible across the spectrum in relationality and organizational ethics and financial responsibilities, in the way that we handle ourselves with other countries, in the way we handle ourselves with each other. So being that America has some difficulties in that setting, not to speak of other countries, but just to look at our own country, I think we're lacking in foresight. There are areas of America that have very strong foresight. Generally, those are elusive, a little bit hidden, kind of like foresight is in general. However, they exist. So when I think about it from a perspective as a psychologist, I think, okay, how do we train ourselves towards foresight? So I'll give a small example. John Gottman and his research on relationships out of University of Washington, profound research over the last 30 years, which has discovered some major areas of relationship and what breaks us down, can predict things, can have foresight about relationships in a very quick space that ends up being profoundly impactful over the next 2 and 3 and 5 and 10 and 15 years. So for example, he can predict at a 95% rate within 5 minutes how likely a coupleship is to divorce or to go towards what he called negative sentiment override, to the level of that negative sentiment override that the relationship decides to go apart from each other and not come back to each other. That would be important knowledge for all of us in business, in personal life, in relational life, in the way that we're working with others. And mainly it has to do with a systemic way of looking at the world, and that if I am this type of person, I'm generally going to attract this type of person, or if I'm this type of organization, we could extrapolate. I'm generally going to attract this type of customer base or this type of other organizations that I'm aligned with. Other type of unwritten psychological truths that fall into foresight that are just like that are things like that we all understand some, like the only person in the world you can change is yourself. I think we would all say that. But then there's these unwritten rules that are not as easily detected but come from foresight, in my opinion, that would be helpful in the life of leadership. For example, when you change yourself, others around you have to change. That's an interesting power. So, for example, if in my relationships with others I get more defensive or more fortified or more rigid or more severe for the next 30 days, it's somewhat predictable how people will respond to me. Probably with something like, what's going on? Gee, I don't like this very much. Wow, I wish this person wasn't as severe. It's going to be somewhat predictable. I'm going to get irritated and eventually different types of responses beyond irritation. Probably things like anger, frustration, maybe attacks. There's just certain things that are going to come about if I change myself to become less fully human, I guess. If I change myself to become more fully human, it's not generally what we think. It doesn't mean it suddenly goes over into the right space, because all humans wonder if, am I really going to change, or is this just a phase I'm going through? So generally changing to a greater space or a more ultimate space or a more fully human space as a leader, as a person, as a servant of others is going to get resistance first. Then it's because it needs to see, is this actually going to happen? That's the difference between what we call first order and second order change. First order, it just changes for a bit and then it pops back to the same shape it was in. Second order, it changes for the long term. And then we see the changes. Then we see the system start to realign itself, into a better space. So foresight, I think, is incredibly powerful. I think Greenleaf had a wonderful grasp of foresight and the responsibilities of foresight, that not only are servant leaders responsible to have foresight, they're responsible, in my opinion, to create collective responsibility for foresight, so that the entire organization or the entire system that we're in has the kind of foresight that's necessary in order to guarantee, or at least give us a much better chance at experiencing our way of being in the world in its more full forms or in its most ultimate forms. And if we just extrapolate that out, that would be, can we actually gather ourselves with the kind of foresight we need for things like the current state of the globe, the environment, financial, the way people relate to each other, the nature of violence, the nature of enmity. Those I think are some major areas of foresight that we need, coming from the individual level all the way through to the organization, all the way through to national levels. That's some thoughts on foresight. How did Gottman get to great foresight? How did he get to predict these things? He started to notice that people attract to themselves their own level of maturity or their own level of immaturity. That's a foresight, right? That we attract ourselves our own level of maturity or immaturity. So then he started to break that down even into behaviors, thoughts, patterns of action, patterns of inaction, and how people relate, and then even all the way down into facial expression, the types of words they use, the thoughts that are driving those words, the thoughts that are driving those facial expressions, the interior that would be driving the thoughts. So we're getting down into consciousness, the way people are with each other, consciously and unconsciously in the depth of their being, or the depth of their soul, maybe we could say, and then how they relate to others. So a fortified, defended, protected, fearful, angry, troubled self is going to attract that type of other on the other side of them. And a self that has contentment, has grace and ease, has discipline, has responsibility, has community, forgiveness asking, changing, loving, serving, generally is going to attract that. And I think we can kind of map that out a little bit when we look at situations. It's not linear like 1, 2, 3 and has a lot of mystery to it. However, we notice when we see something ultimate happening that goes towards ultimate good or ultimate truth or ultimate beauty, these beautiful Jesuit terms that help us understand the world, we usually can see critical mass that's been reached at a certain level, and then it's the community or the system has broken over into a deeper expression. And so I think that foresight becomes pretty important. So back to Gottman, how did he do that? Obviously a lot of reading and a lot of science and a lot of research, but there's one thing that reminds me often of how foresight, we want to seek it to get trained in it. He started to know that it had a lot to do with, you could see it in facial expression. You could see what was driving people and how they handled their faces, or what their faces did with their emotions and what they were speaking. So he went to France and studied under a facial expression expert for a year. Most of us would not think of doing that, right? And that kind of still blows my mind and makes me think, okay, who would I study under regarding leadership foresight? I think that's a good question. Who would and then if we take that out into the other characteristics, who would I study under regarding being a servant leader who heals, who is a healer? Who would I study under regarding being a servant leader in any of the 10 characteristics? And how might I surrender to that study? How might I listen deeply enough, being the first characteristic, listening deeply enough to change in ways that not just me, but a critical mass of servant leaders can move something that would be needed or healing oriented in the family and the organization among nations.